All right, so now that we understand what this pack stuff is, let's actually make a real quick sim based on, once again, our cool pig head thing here. Now I want to have a bunch of these because that's the whole point of this. I'm going to put all these guys onto a bunch of points that we get from a box. Alrighty, so that's our box there. So we're seeing the points. The reason why they're pointing away, kind of like a Gothic fountain or something, or maybe a CD cover, I don't know. They're pointing all the different ways because the normals of this box are actually pointing out. We might even be able to see it. Yeah, there they are. So the pig heads are basically angled towards those normals, but it doesn't, because it's just a normal. It's just one vector. It's just pointing in. You can imagine if you were to put something on this, if you spike something down onto this normal, you would be able to rotate it around that spike. And that's what's happening here. We don't really, it's not defined well what rotation it should have. So as we get into more about matrices and those 16 by 16 transformation matrices, we'll learn why those are far superior. They're able to define an actual, this is the rotation at this point, as opposed to here is the direction it's facing, but we don't know what rotation it has. In the meantime, by deleting the geometry actually on this, so now we went from having the box to no box. Now there's no normals. The normals were implied by the fact that this face faces up, this face faces right, and then this face faces this way. So it kind of makes an average of it, which is how we get that spike. By deleting all the faces on it, it can't do that anymore. So now we don't have a normal. So that's why everybody faces the right way now. Cool. So I'm going to make this box a lot bigger. So we'll spread them out essentially. So, and remember, this is the box here. And we can also add these divisions to it. So now we're making a box. We're making all these points. I don't really care about the structure, the lattice structure that binds them together, because again, we're just going to turn it into this anyway. I just want to make a cool grid where I can have all my cool pig friend heads here hang out. And I'll make them smaller, because why not? Where's the ground? Alrighty, cool. So we got all those pig heads. Let's move them above ground, because I'm going to put a ground plane where y is 0 there in a minute. So let's just move them up and rotate it. And remember, all of this is being stored in the actual intrinsic primitive stuff here, or primitive intrinsics. So if I do, let's say, packed full transform is the translation and rotation, as opposed to just the rotation, which you can get from just transform here. As we move these things, you'll notice that those numbers will change. See? That's how it's storing the rotation, is via these matrices. Great. So we've got 64 of these duplicated instances, essentially. So let's move it a little up. Great. Let's make a DOP network. Now, we can make a DOP network out in this area here, as you've seen me do before in other lessons. I'm just arbitrarily not going to do that this time, just to show you another way of doing it. Let's make a null, and we'll just say, hey, these are I usually refer to them as pieces, and I spelled pieces wrong. There we go. So I'll go in here. So what are the main ingredients? We need an RBD packed object. Makes sense. We want to point it to pieces. There it is. If we look, there it is. We already have it. Great. What else do we need? We need a rigid body solver. The rigid body solver really contains all of the different solvers. You can do the old school ODE, which you'll never do. The RBD, which was Houdini's own built-in rigid body solver, but it's not used as much anymore. And this is a dynamic fracturing thing that we're not going to use. So, rigid body solver, rigid body object, gravity. We need a ground plane. We need to spell ground plane correctly. And we need to merge. Merge will define our collision. By default, it says left inputs right. We have the ground plane on the left here. If you didn't want to think about it, you can do mutual. Then it doesn't matter which side it's on. And that's it. That's everything we need to do this. So just press play. And there they go. And they all land on each other. And there you go. We made a rigid body simulation. How about that? Wonderful. We should probably define some kind of camera too. So I'm just going to go here, control click camera, lock it so I can move it somewhere. That seems good. Then hide it because who cares? And there you go. So they're all colliding with each other. We can now take a look at a few things in the DOP network here. A lot of the important stuff is going to be on here on the RBD packed object. For example, we can show guide geometry, which is pretty important. Oh, let's turn that off. You'll see something very important to realize about Bullet is that it does this. This is the collision geometry for Bullet in blue. What it's making is it's drawing a convex, let's say, boundary around our geometry. Our geometry is more complicated than that. It has all these indents, or let's say this is concave here. Convex means that, you know, everything is facing outwards. It never comes back in on itself the way this does. See how this is going out, this is facing out. If you were to imagine the normals essentially on it, they would be pointing away, but then these ones would start to point back in again. That makes it concave. So this has to be convex. And as you can see, geometry representation, convex hull. And there it is. This is what Bullet wants. You can do things like box. Box is super fast because it's very simple. It fits a box the best it can to it, and you'll see it still looks like that. But the problem, of course, is you get things like this. See this guy? He doesn't look like he's resting on anything. He is, according to this representation. They turn red when they're not moving anymore, so it's less for Bullet to think about, just for the record. But this is not a good representation. We can also do a sphere. Spheres have a similar problem. They're even easier, actually, to calculate than cubes are, but it's the same issue where now everything's rolling in a bizarre way that doesn't make sense for the kind of geometry that it is. But they are still convex. The sphere is convex. The box is convex because it never, again, has a crack or moves back in on itself. Convex hull, which is the default, is usually what you use. It's a little bit slower than those spheres, but it's still relatively fast in general. The convexity is a big part of why Bullet is fast. Is because it's making these simplified versions of your geometry. Our geometry had 3,000 polygons in it, but it's too much. It's too much to do all the tests that are required to see if any little piece of that surface is interpenetrating. This way, Bullet has to check far less. It only has to check basically the points at the peaks of the convex shape. And it just sees quickly if it's within the simplified representation of anybody else. And of course, because it's packed, it only has to do this one time. It stores the convex thing once, it stores the overall thing once. It still has to do the calculations for them colliding with each other for everybody, but the actual memory-wise, it's still very efficient.